Am I audible? I assume I'm audible. I mean, you were on the mic check, haven't you? So great. That doesn't have it. Okay. Okay. 3, 2, 1, go. Just like all media, this media portrayal is likely to be unrealistic. It is likely to paint the reception that you receive for this as something that is positive, and worse, even in cases where it paints as a negative, i.e. your parents don't like the fact you're LGBT, it's likely to still show it in a way where there's a happy ending and they come round to it and they like the fact in the end that you are LGBT. This just means that one, for those who it's not safe to come out, are more encouraged to come out than they do already, such as those with conservative parents. But secondly, it means for those who do come out and would have come out anyway, because it's quite safe to do so, they have unrealistic expectations over what this looks like. A few pieces of framing then, but I just want to start with who the people that this actually matters most to. Because just note, not that matters most to, but the actual people affected by this. Because just note that many people come out anyway, regardless to this LGBT media. Note that you're likely to come out if you're in a relatively safe environment, regardless to this LGBT media. Note if you have liberal parents who are going to be okay with this, you've grown up with a young age from these people, so you're likely to be okay with the idea of coming out to them and coming out in general because they've raised you from a young age to feel like this. If you have liberal friends, other LGBT people, other gay people that your friends have had, and seeing that is relatively positive. Once again, if you live in a conservative country, you're not likely to do that. If you live in like a relatively liberal community in a liberal country, you're more likely to because you've seen the reaction of other people around you. The people then who often don't come out under the status quo, who are encouraged to come out by this narrative, are those who are in more conservative communities, those who have conservative friends and those in conservative countries, but also especially those who have conservative parents who is likely to backlash against them and not like it, who is likely in the worst cases to cut you off, to kick you out the home, and even not in the worst cases to shame you, talk bad on you. So you see the people who cared for you and who you know best in life talking about you like you're lower than them or you're doing something wrong just because of your identity. Why is it the case then that this is likely to be an unrealistic portrayal? Why is it likely to be either a portrayal where it is exclusively a positive reaction that you have when you come out and your anxiety over coming out is alleviated, or why is it always likely to be a portrayal where even if your parents are conservative, they come round in the end and there's a happy ending to it? 4 reasons why this is the case. Firstly, and why is it likely to be exaggerated more than the status quo, more than this actually happens under the status quo, and parents do actually come round and you do actually have a positive reception? 4 reasons why. Firstly, because of the fact they don't want to actually look homophobic. No media studio wants to look homophobic, and like it's putting out videos that look and films that look at media like it looks like it's homophobic, and this is the ending of the story, and this is the main story, because they don't want to put up LGBT viewers and just liberal viewers in general, which will just tank their viewing figures. Secondly, because it's wrote by people who are not LGBT themselves often. Most people are not LGBT themselves, so most directors and scriptwriters are not LGBT. What this means is it means that even though they'll still make these sort of films because of the fact they want to market to these audiences, and because it's trendy to watch these sort of films, not just as an LGBT person, but as a liberal person, they'll still make them. But they'll make them in unrealistic ways because they don't have the lived experiences as an LGBT person. What this looks like then is making it look unrealistic and look unrealistically happy because you don't know how actual conservative parents react to these situations. But note, even if we do accept that it's made by people who are LGBT, no, these are probably relatively privileged LGBT people around people who are reasonably liberal and reasonable people in general. It is not likely to be people, it's likely to be people in the West as well, and likely to be people in the most conservative communities in other countries, but more developing countries, and also in poor backgrounds where anti-LGBT views due to lack of education are still more prevalent. Thirdly, no, they just want to sell these films to the LGBT community and to liberal people who want to watch films about LGBT people. What this means is it means that you really wanted to have a positive view of LGBT people and be something that you would find happy to watch. No LGBT person is going to buy, or no pro-LGBT person is going to buy this and spend money on this media if they just got to make them unhappy because it has a sad ending and people just react badly and people backlash against this person coming out. Fourthly, note that most stories just have a happy ending and a positive in the end for the main protagonist. This is something that we come to expect of stories, and you want to feel happiness at the end of the film. Note, because of this, you're likely to have a happy ending, even if it has twists and turns in it, such as your parents being conservative. Note then, why is it likely that you internalize this and expect your parents and the people around you to react more positively than they do then? Note that this is because, one, you often view this media at a young age. Note that most LGBT people first start to view this sort of media or when they're relatively young as a teenager and they start to come out themselves or start to realize themselves that they are LGBT. This means they have relatively little experience talking to other people and talking to other people who are LGBT. Note it's even more true in conservative communities where there's even less other LGBT people to talk to. Note this means that you often, this is your only viewpoint that you have into this. This is your only viewpoint that you have into what the LGBT community looks like at this age. Note though, as well, secondly, just note we glorify what's in the media. We see this as above ourselves. It has exciting stories that grab our attention and grab at us. You have movie stars that are often glorified as seen as special in these things. So you internalize that this is something that's special and something that you should be following. Okay, before impacts, I'm going to take CG. So Theo.
So I watched Breaking Bad and I saw a pretty good depiction of the wealth and splendor that can come from becoming a meth cook. It didn't cause me to do anything other than my degree in life. So why is
Dylan, you're a middle class bloke. Most people who come, maybe there are some meth addicts actually from working class backgrounds that actually do follow Breaking Bad because you think you can be rich. Maybe not middle class, Dylan, apologies for that. But like that's a debate. But okay, it may persuade other people if not you. But also just note as well on top of that, that as the analysis I've literally just given you, this is often the only people you can relate to on this issue because you're at a young age and this is the first time you see other LGBT people who are like you and other LGBT people from the same background as you and you can relate to them. Note also this is not like in Breaking Bad, there's other negative effects that are portrayed, or these are just likely to be positive. Okay, why is this bad then? Two reasons. Firstly, for those who actually expected to come out, as in those who I mentioned in my framing at the beginning, who would have came out anyway because they're in relatively liberal backgrounds, their expectations don't meet reality because when they come out, the reactions around them are not as positive and as celebratory as they expect. Maybe they're still positive as they are, as these are liberal people, but they're not to the level that they expect. As this is what they've expected since they realize they're LGBT and they've built this up inside of them, it is then so disappointing and upsetting. But secondly, particularly for those who are in those risky backgrounds, for those who have parents who are conservative, in conservative communities, who are in conservative areas, no, for these people, this is particularly bad because for these people, it is like these people are likely, more likely to come out when they're actually at risk of their parents backlashing against them and other people around, and are at risk of your parents reacting badly, disowning them, kicking them out, or in less bad scenarios, just simply looking down at them like they've done something wrong and unethical because of who they are. Note that these people are just simply worse off. They're more likely to come out firstly, and they're more likely to just be worse off, be exposed to parents who are bad, etc. And this is something that I am proud to stand in OG for.
We thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Can we now invite the Leader of the Opposition, please? Here.
I'm audible, right? Okay. Just a second. Yep. Just before I start my speech, sorry if I sound like a heterosexual Balkan man. This is because it is the case. Starting in okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Coming out is actually good in the vast majority of cases, I would say, because inevitably you're going to be doing it, so might as well do it sooner than later. We're going to first explain how this narrative looks like. Secondly, we're going to explain what is going to be done well, contest the reason that is coming from OG, and finally, we're going to talk about how this largely improves discourse and the way in which you emotionally feel, irrespective of whether you come out or not. Firstly, I would say that in the vast majority of cases, this is going to explore your thought process, experiences with other people, and generally speaking, your life as a whole prior to coming out, because this is the necessary prerequisite for you to have an interesting and exciting narrative, because you have to firstly understand that there is suspicion, suspense, doubt in your identity, and then you have to necessarily come out. But secondly, in the vast majority of cases, this also explores the process afterwards, how you're dealing with friends or parents that are acting negatively, how you're confronting like issues of body dysmorphia or other specific interpersonal or personal issues when you're changing your identity, how society generally perceives it. I want to put a very specific emphasis here. Putting an emphasis on coming out necessarily means having more time to build nuanced narratives, because you're spending much more time on that specific story arc for that specific character. You're not just putting it, just announcing it on the side, which necessarily means that there is a higher degree of focus. Now, why wouldn't this be done well? The first broad thing that I'm going to say is that OG isn't right. People fucking love sadness. This is why the most popular Netflix shows are those in which kids are doing drugs and being very sad. Because in the vast majority of cases, people have interpersonal struggles. They have gone through trauma. They're actively suffering, and they wish to see something realistic, gritty, something fucking relatable. This is why many people enjoy sadness, enjoy struggle, because it is relatable to them and they don't feel alone. Secondly, taking them at their very best. Even if there is positivity, it is only at the end. Why? Because the most stereotypical story arcs are usually the character having struggles, going through pain, anguish, and then coming triumphant in the end and having hope in the end, which necessarily means even if there is positivity, it is only in the end, after the challenges of the person, like going through that specific transition, coming out to their parents, which necessarily means it's not going to be done horribly. Thirdly, this is a massive industry, which means if one specific show does it horribly, other shows are taking notes of the massive negative feedback, and they likely wish to do it better because they have profit incentives to do so. This is not a singular show, but a massive industry. Fourthly, in many cases, they wish to specifically appeal to that community. This is a very sensitive topic because it was a life-changing moment for them. They're often in a very vocal in social media and in other sites about the way in which it was done, which means they have a massive incentive to do it sensibly in a very realistic way, which is why in the vast majority of cases, they're spending a shit ton of time exploring the character, their interactions, their doubts before coming out and afterwards, instead of like being ousted by somebody else or just mentioning it on the side. Fifthly, OG is again incorrect. In the vast majority of cases, people that are writing those are directors that have those previous experiences, or you're hiring actors who are also of that particular sexuality or have similar experiences, because they can better portray the character, and they can also give feedback on how to specifically portray it in a better way, which means, and even if this is not the case, you have advisors and a profit incentive to make it in the most nuanced and possible way, which actively means that you are likely to have people that are actively improving the story. 5 reasons as to why this will be done well. They have to actively engage with them. Now, why is this necessary? They say in the vast majority of cases, people come out without problems. I would say that sure, in some cases, in the most liberal societies, but even in like developed nations, there's massive degrees of discrimination and denial for those specific people, which vastly expands the scope of this debate. Why is this likely to be the case? Because I would say that the first broad reason is that in many cases, there is a fundamental belief that society, like only 2 genders exist, and generally speaking, people are unable to actively empathize with this, meaning that if it's something that is fundamentally different, if they believe this is something biologically that shouldn't be working, in many cases, they're actively gaslighting you because it's such a foreign concept to them, irrespective of how liberal they may appear to be on other issues, which necessarily means that in many cases, they're likely to actively gaslight you, saying that this is just a phase, saying that you are delusional, saying this is just an attitude or a way of behavior that is currently trendy, which is something like notoriously popular in the Balkans. But I would say that secondly, in many cases, it is your parents that even if society is currently liberal, your parents are older and more conservative. They have actively those beliefs, your like older friends, relatives, generally speaking, those beliefs that are actively indoctrinating you every single day, which makes it very hard for you to transition because you are actively actively influenced by it. But I would say that thirdly, it is very hard, irrespective of the political and social situation, to come out because this is a massive change on the way in which you perceive yourself and others may perceive you as well, right? Because this is something that changes the way in which you interact with people, the way in which you see yourself. You are not sure how people will react. If you're an anxious and insecure person, as many people appear to be in those situations, you're more likely to negatively exaggerate the perception, the likelihood of people to act negatively, which necessarily means that it is very hard to come out in the vast majority of cases. Why do we make this better? I would say that firstly, we're massively able to normalize this, because in the vast majority of cases, what literature, what media, and what TV shows especially manage to do is get very intimate and very intense in you being able to see the thought process of that person. You feel as though you're walking in their shoes. You intimately see how they're evolving in the screen and you actively relate to them, which necessarily means that you create a massive amount of normalization at the point in which you feel that this is something real that you're continuously seeing in media. But secondly, I would say that you are more likely to see discussions online, because many people, after watching the show and having doubts as to whether or not they may have a different sexuality or they may struggle with their own gender identity, necessarily are going to separate it to social social media to discuss the show, and there people after seeing the show are more likely to be inspired to share their own stories of coming out, and they're more likely to be asymmetrically exposed and to see it as more normalized. Before I continue, I'll take a point. Yes.
Queer people are ideologically diverse. Let's say one audience member is a trans medicalist and thinks gender dysphoria is inherent, another thinks it's fluid. How are you going to represent the coming out process?
You can just have different shows or multiple characters that have different experiences. You don't have to have a single character nor a single show to express one particular experience. So just don't understand how that works. Secondly, I think it's massively better for coming out because in the end, it is positive. It gives you hope that eventually it will be better. And irrespective of that, if you relate to the characters, you feel as though you're not alone. And it gives you a lot of tips and tricks on how people are likely to react, which makes you more likely to be better able and to more likely to come out altogether. So I think this is massively important because firstly, in terms of feelings, you are more likely to understand how you feel. Why do you have this fucking cognitive dissonance? Why are you not like attracted to like the other gender we are supposed to be because society tells you otherwise? Irrespective of whether you come out or not, the feeling that you are not alone, that there is a character similar to you, actively makes you feel better because you're not alone. You feel more comfortable, and generally speaking, you're more likely to feel better. But secondly, I would say that preemptively, you're more likely to come out sooner because if this is something inevitable, if this is an unchangeable part of your nature, we want to remove the toxic influences of your friends, relatives, community for you to give you more time to actively explore your identity, not to have massive regrets that you didn't come out 15 years ago. So I think coming out sooner is also a benefit. For all those reasons, protocols.
We thank the leader of the opposition for the defining speech. Can we now have the Deputy Prime Minister please here?
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Second. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Look, we think that when OO says, you're going to come out anyways, it's better to do it sooner than later. We think this is absolutely false. Recognize that a lot of times people who are considering coming out are oftentimes teenagers, people who are coming to terms with their sexuality, people who are coming to terms with like who they are as a person, right? This is really important because recognize that teenagers don't have jobs, they don't have a degree, they oftentimes rely heavily on people immediately around them, so like their family, for example, to even like survive on the day-to-day. This is why, when especially in like conservative circles, we think it's extremely important that we play it safe and sorry, and like extend this coming out process as compared to like rushing it out because they think that it's going to be all roses and rainbows, right? I think let's just be very clear what the comparative is on our side. Even if we accept that it's somehow going to be less like LGBTQ portrayal, which we don't think is true simply because the audience still exists, recognize that what happens on our side is that what's likely going to happen is that you're only going to come out when you feel safe. So this means that for liberal individuals, it's probably going to come out at the same time like in their teens because their family are safe anyways. But for people who are in conservative families, what then happens is they go out into uni, for example, they meet people who are different from them. They meet people who are actually liberal. They meet people who are also LGBTQ community, individuals. They maybe go out to the workforce. They interact with individuals who are different from them, who are part of the community. This is really important because now you actually are in a position where one, you have like tangible social supports and people around you who can actually help you if anything goes wrong. But two, like if you're already at a point where you're financially more secure, this means that you have maybe your own house, you have your own job, for example. Even if in the worst case that your parents completely like kick you out and disown you, this means that you're still able to survive. You're still going to have a fulfilling life without like having a future ruined because like you can't go to uni or whatever, right? This means on our side, we rather take like, even if like coming out is the best thing in the world, we rather take like have this delay insofar as we can ensure that it's safer for most individuals. But let's like deal with what OO brings up, right? I think OO does two things in their speech today. Firstly, they talk about depiction. They give us 5 reasons why the depiction is going to be correct, right? Let's go mechanism and mechanism and tell you why all of them are wrong. Firstly, they tell us, films focus on the thought process. They often deal with things like what happens after you come out, right? A few things here. I think it just doesn't deal with the mechanisms that Matt tells you in terms of like the directors who are actually in like the positions who are like directing this film, who are actually writing the stories, right? Recognize that one, oftentimes most directors in most mainstream Hollywood movies and like the biggest like studios in Hollywood are oftentimes rich, privileged men, right? Recognize that oftentimes in the past, Hollywood has been like blatantly homophobic and has like stomped out and like pushed away people who are like part of the LGBTQ community, right? This means that the status quo is extremely hard to find people who are actually part of the community in these positions of power. But two, even if you have LGBTQ directors. One, they're extremely rare. Two, they're probably going to be part of like smaller companies who are like more accepting of these individuals. We think that what happens then is that they're still privileged. They're still going to have a very specific like experience that is not like representative of what most people, especially those in conservative areas, actually experience, right? This means that you don't actually know the thought process of people who actually have like extremely conservative family members who actually have a bad ending anyways. But then they say too, people enjoy struggles and therefore like, you know, the triumphant ending is like really great. Look, like this is exactly the point that Matt tells you. It's still a happily ever after. Like even if you have homophobic parents, they're still gonna like suddenly change their mind, renounce their religion and say, you know what, I still love you because you're my kid. Recognize this isn't true, right? For the majority of cases, recognize that parents see like the kids as an extension of themselves, and they also hold like religion very dearly to them. This means that like, especially when they're told by like religious authorities that, you know, you're going to go to hell if, you know, you are gay, for example. This means that like, one, you come from a position of like care, supposed care, when you tell your kids that no, you know, being gay is wrong. But two, I think you also see them as a disappointment and you're less likely to actually accept them for who they are. Three, they tell us, oh, there's other companies as competition. Look, like Hollywood is pretty much like an oligopoly, right? So you have like a few main companies. These companies are the ones who've told you have existing structures that prevent LGBTQ individuals from reaching positions of power. We think this is not likely to have like even if there's like some small ones, like small indie films that are good, they're not like mainstream enough to actually impact people, especially like conservative individuals who probably don't actually are like aware of these. But the fourth, they tell us, oh, it's a sensitive topic. Exactly because it's a sensitive topic, right? Even within the community itself, you have disagreements about what is actually the correct like way to like view certain issues like your sexuality or like whether like, you know, what is asexuality, for example, right? We think it's extremely important because this means that like insofar as like, you know, companies are essentially profit motivated, they want to get the majority of like the viewing like consumer base, right? They will actually focus and take the safest option, right? This means they'll do things like take the happiest ending and say like, you know, in the end everything works out. This is the kind of decisions they'll make. But then they tell us, oh, you have advisors and actors who are always who are probably going to be LGBTQ and can represent this properly. Look, whitewashing exists. It still happens even to the like the status quo, right? We don't understand why necessarily Hollywood would change for like LGBTQ individuals and why they will represent them accurately. I think for just all the same reasons as you've talked about. But then secondly, they talk about conservative communities. They tell us that firstly, coming out is very important because it changes the way that you see yourself and change the way you interact with other people. Look, I think you can come to terms with the fact that you're gay and lesbian or whatever your sexual identity is without having to tell people that you're so and so, right? And we think this is especially true when other people are much more like when you tell people who are conservative and they're going to tell you that you're going to like tell you to doubt yourself and to say that this is just a phase, right? We think this is extremely the reason why like you shouldn't have come out at a stage where you're still vulnerable and whatnot. But before I continue, I'll take POI from closing.
What do you intend to focus on in these stories instead?
Look, like, okay, we think that there's like these stories, like LGBTQ films will probably still continue to exist. We think that maybe because of like decreased incentive, there might be more focus on things like for example, have this for example, things like the kinds of struggles that they actually face, for example. We think this is much more informative because it informs the struggles that people actually face. But then, like, moving back to like what Oo mentioned about conservative communities, right? I think then they tell us, oh, you exaggerate how badly you think it will go. Look, we think that like this is probably a safety mechanism because the people who exaggerate how badly it will go are probably people who've been like told by and conditioned by society that it's going to go badly, i.e. they're in conservative communities, right? We think that this is likely to be the case, i.e. if they come out, they're probably going to face backlash, they're going to face condemnation. We think this is exactly why it's better to be safe than sorry. But then they say, oh, you now see discussions online, you can connect with people. Look, like even if we say that now you have less ability to like connect with these fandoms and like support structures, recognize that like your friend from across the ocean can't actually help you if like your family kicks you out. Like you don't actually like you form like relationships, online relationships that don't actually help you in real life because they can't be there for you. They can't like actually help you if your family does something to you, right? We think this means that the most important kind of support structure at the end of the day are people around you, i.e. people that you actually meet later on in life, which is why we think that it's far more important that you delay your coming out, to when you're safe, and because of this, OG.
We thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that. Thank you here.
Hi, I presume you can hear me. Okay. POI's in chat. Let's open from closing and at around 5, and I'll start in just a sec. Okay. So, starting in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, why this will be done well? They have counter reasons, we have counter reasons, let's break them down. One, they say, and their own reasons really, really backstab them most of the time. One, they say you don't want to seem homophobic, right? So that's why you implement those themes. But it seems inherent to me that firstly, if you want to cater to LGBTQ community, you have to do it in a nuanced way, because otherwise they'll say, no, this is not the actual average experience. Most people don't have this experience, especially even still in liberal areas where they have a lot of tendencies to have a hard time coming out, even if they are in such a liberal place. Secondly, though, I think generally they say, oh, directors are white men who are rich, don't have expertise. I think there's two things. One, maybe there aren't people in power who are in the LGBTQ community, but most of the time you interview regular people in order to get a lot of information about what will happen, especially when you don't have a lot of information about this. And note, a lot of directors are being called out exactly because they're not being nuanced and portraying things in a very vanilla type of way, which is something that most people don't want to fucking watch, because it's not something they relate to, and it's not something that is making them feel represented. Secondly, I think generally what they say is you want positive endings, so on and so forth. Note that a lot of movies, fair enough, to this point, have a lot of happy endings. But the difference is that people are getting tired of it. This is why rom-coms are failing as well, because they're just too generic, and people have watched too many of those storylines that they're getting bored. That's why shows like Euphoria have been able to succeed tremendously, because of the difference that they bring in the different perspectives of many different people. Note, one good example of good interpretation of this media will likely take over all the hundreds of bad examples, right? Because all the other ones won't catch up. They won't likely be the main thing that is discussed within media. I think this is something reasonable to presume that will happen. Now, three ways that even if media is a bit as not nuanced, as perfect as both governments would like to claim, this is still good. One, you provoke a lot more discourse, right? We have a lot of mechanisms why this normalizes the process of you discussing the process of coming out, which on the alternative, they don't prove they have. They assert that this is likely to be the case, but don't never prove it. What this means is, firstly, if the media is that bad, you have discussions on forums such as Reddit or Facebook groups or whatever that scrutinize those medias and actively tell people, no, this is not what it happens. Here's how it happened for me. And note that this is likely to be the case because of the unlimited that you have, and you generally are not scared to discuss your experiences with other people. Secondly, and note what is likely going to be the alternative to this. If you don't have those narratives, it's very likely that you have worse of them. Things like queer baiting, things like having storylines that don't even include the LGBTQ community. Why? Because one, if the wider audience you have in terms of filmmaking are white straight people or whoever you want, you have to in some way engage them. And know that coming out stories are the only unique way for you to do so. Why? Because coming out stories engage people who are straight as well, in terms of what are their reactions, how they support the people who are coming out, how they see the bad examples of people, how they treat poor people who come out, which is something that uniquely allows the other people outside of the LGBTQ community to be able to engage with this mainstream media. Why is this? Because one normalizes it within the whole community, which is either firstly good because people get comfort for their feelings, but for LGBTQ, but secondly, you get people who are straight, to have a better understanding of what the process is, to be more empathetic and to treat others better. This means not joking about it or forcing people to come out because they see how devastating it could be if you do this forcibly. Third thing, note that generally, I think most of the time, no, that's not third thing. Now, let's engage specifically with their case. One, they say you will be forced out to come out in conservative communities and you get kicked out. Few things. One, you have a lot of ways to know how your parents will react and not be delusionized by the good media. This looks like, for example, seeing how your parents react to LGBT policies within your country and see your father cuss some people out, and presumably you can connect the dots that likely he will not react well for you coming out. And I think you can make the cost-benefit analysis of him if you realizing that this is going to happen. Secondly, you can see how they react to movies, such as especially Euphoria, when they win big awards and it's in the mainstream media, and see how your parents discuss it and react to it. Secondly, though, know that most people have a lot of information about their own circumstances and they know best what is good for them to do when. This means that when the best case is, even if you see this media, you can dissociate yourself from the character. You see obvious differences, not only because of your appearance, because of your storyline, your background, all those stuff, which means that you can understand that there are certain differences that may not apply to you. So if you want to come out, you can see that they will likely not have the same reaction. Now, I would have a lot of mitigations in terms of, I think, one, most people would likely not kick out their kids or just generally behave very poorly to them for the reasons that they themselves say, which is that parents care for their kids even if they don't always agree with them. So I'm unsure what the huge harm is on their side, whereas there are tremendous benefits on ours. What are they exactly? Firstly, people who have a lot of counter narratives that pushes them to not come out. This is explained within Bister's speech about how if you are scared of what the consequences will be if you come out. There are a lot of narratives that tell you that you're delusional, that coming out is something that is just a phase, all those stuff. Why is this uniquely good in counterbalancing this? It's just actively explores in a more analytical way what it is like to come out and what are the tendencies of people who might want to come out to have. This looks like, for example, showing people having different sort of attractions within media and questioning what their sexuality is. For example, when Rue was very uncomfortable in heterosexual relationships with men and she realized when she was a lesbian, this can someone who is watching from the screen can realize, you know, media and movies are the best way for you to do so because they can you can put yourself in the shoes of the character or just generally understand their motives and the consequences of their psyche afterwards. Before I continue, CG.
No one in Euphoria comes out. Everyone has queer relationships. The sexualities are implied. You don't need to have coming out for this.
Sure, but no, coming out is unique narrative that shows you what are the things you feel beforehand and what happens afterwards. Even if their shows are not uniquely about coming out, there are still a lot of instances where you come out, and this is one example. I'm just trying to be relatable. Well, okay, maybe there are other medias fucked up. Now, secondly, generally, what I think is unsymmetrical in that thing is that COG themselves say that people in conservative communities don't have access to other LGBTQ people in their areas, which means that the internet is the only way for them to have this sort of information about what it is like to come out, what are the differences and what are the hardships that you have to go through. It also looks like people in the community sharing tips on how to come out or generally how to deal with the consequences, which is unique to this focus because it makes more of it. Even if you have some on government side, you have to accept that it is more on our side on aggregate, which means that more people might get help. Why is this extremely important? 4 points of weight. One, it gives people comfort that their difficulties after coming out are something that most people feel. The point that when you see that someone who is coming out is struggling, having body dysmorphia, all those things, makes you feel that you are not the only one and that you have some people who can relate to you in that regard. Secondly, you coming out is a freeing motion. You feel you are able to express yourself in a way that you hadn't had before, and you can actively find meaningful relationships. If you understand yourself better, note coming out is not always to other people, it's always coming out to yourself and understanding your own preferences. But lastly, it allows people who are straight to just understand the process better and be more empathetic, which we believe is also as important votas.
We thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech. And now to open the closing exchange, can we call a member of government, please? Here.
Three extensions from CG. First, how this perpetuates essentialist narratives. Secondly, how it leads to gatekeeping. And thirdly, how it makes closeted people depressed. The upshot of opening opposition is that queer art is going to be produced in a nuanced way. Sure, but they give no reasons why queer art not focusing on coming out stories wouldn't equally be focused on nuanced way. Therefore, the debate is that queer art is going to happen anyway. It's just what queer art should look like. The only unique mechanism they give is that coming out stories are uniquely interesting to straight people because they also involve stories of you talking to your sister or your brother or them overcoming this. But I would like to note that just queer people existing on cinema are also engaging for straight people, because if you have a queer girlfriend and you're a woman, also your mother might react to this differently, even if you don't explicitly identify as a lesbian. So let's be really sure, let's be really clear about the comparative in this debate. First piece of characterization. Queer theory is philosophically diverse, therefore queer cinema is also philosophically diverse. Notably, there are two streams of queer thought that are really popular right now. But the first one is essentialism, that opening opposition talks a lot about. It's the idea that you are born queer and your process of self-discovering is just unpacking some essential metaphysical identity that you always had. With trans people, this is the instance of transmedicalism, the idea that you are literally born in a wrong body and it's a medical condition that needs to be fixed. The counterfactual, however, is that sexuality and gender identity is fluid with no fixed identity. The way this is portrayed in cinema is, on the one hand, exactly as OO says, you have a fixed storyline of finding yourself, or the counterfactual of just queer people existing doing queer acts. For instance, two male characters suddenly going into a relationship, or a character that you perceived was a lesbian now goes into a relationship with a man, which implies that her sexuality is a bit more fluid. Notice, even in situations where this is queer baiting, but it isn't if you have explicit explicit queer acts, at least queer baiting is censored less, because it isn't marketed as a queer movie. You just have a scene where a character has an ambiguous sexual identity, so it means that corporations in countries where you have lots of censorship and where people cannot access any art are a little more likely to be seen. Why is this distinction really important? Note that the way queer people perceive themselves is often shaped by queer media. Why? Because there is no accessible queer education in many societies, because queer rights have only recently begun being accepted, and many people do not have circles of queer friends who can be role models about what it means to be queer. So the kind of queer art you consume affects the way you perceive your own queerness. Now, what B6 says in response to my POI is, you can just have both. You can have stories that are representing both essentialist and fluid narratives. 3 responses for this. First of all, there is a limited amount of time that people spend on queer media, especially straight people like your parents in the Balkans, for example. Secondly, there's such a multiplicity of queer identities that you can't cover all philosophies and all perceptions. And thirdly, some shows are just more popular than others, notably those that cater to cis gay men and to cis bisexual women, because there are more of them than say bisexual people. Why is it better then for queer art to show just queer acts rather than people stating their queer identities? First of all, it flips the OO claim on coming out, because when there's this perceived path of what it means to come out, many people who don't have the same trajectory of coming out gaslight themselves and feel an imposter syndrome story. For instance, if the story is that being a trans woman is being intrinsically feminine and discovering that you are feminine, if you're a masculine trans woman, you feel this isn't really me. I am not entitled to come out. I'm not like these other people, which first can exacerbate your gender dysphoria, but in the worst case can prevent you from seeking out like medical care that you need to transition. On the comparative, if you just see characters in media showing different kind of agender behavior, if you're a person who is gender non-conforming, you're more likely to embrace at least some sort of a queer identity. You see on TV, it's just okay in general for people who present male to act feminine, so more people are likely to opt into this narrative and accept themselves, so we flip opening opposition. Secondly, this causes cishet people to doubt your identity if your storyline does not follow the one of coming out. For instance, into the storyline is that you constantly deny your identity, as OO says. You always have really liked boys, but you have never showed it. And if this isn't something that happens in real life, your Balkan parents are going to doubt you. They say, but you never were feminine as a child. You actually did like girls as a child. If they don't understand that sexuality is fluid, they're going to use this as a weapon against you. This literally happened to me, like where like my family said, but you had girl crushes, you can't be queer, and stuff like that. Thirdly, it leads to gatekeeping within the movement. If coming out becomes codified and something that is like really important in order for you to participate in queer discourse, if you don't come out, you're punished disproportionately. Before I get into this, I'm happy to take a point from OO.
You cannot ensure you have this narrative on your side. Ours is a given. But even if you do, know that people cannot relate to the difficulties coming out uniquely on our side, which is something that prompts them to be able to come out and have the bravery. Your side doesn't have.
Given the rise of social media and the multiplicity of queer identities that happen in the lived experiences that are talked about, the counter-narrative of fluidity has sprung up from the grassroots and has infiltrated queer media. This is about the comparative of these two streams. Now, why does gatekeeping happen and why is this horrible? Notice this isn't just about entertainment. It's also about social media, for instance, celebrities coming out and queer discourse on Twitter and just your group chat of queer friends. The problem is when you put an emphasis of coming out as a sign of you being queer, this creates a pressure for people to come out, and this like vertically extend on OG because we contextualize it. For instance, if you are an actor in a queer movie, if you have written a book about queer characters but you're perceived as a straight woman, you're going to be harassed by people. Who are you to queer baits us? Who are you to steal our lived experience if you're not queer? The worst experience of this is Kit Connor, a 17-year-old actor who acted in Heartstopper as a bisexual character, was harassed by people on the internet. Why are you as a straight guy appropriating our culture? And he was forced to come out as a bisexual man. This is extremely dangerous, especially from actors who come from disprivileged communities. Like if you come from a Muslim family and you're like act in a queer role, and now you're forced to come out the fans because otherwise you're queer baiting and stuff like this. But more perniciously trickles down to discourse in general in smaller group chats. That is, if you try to comment on queer metaphysics or talk about queer theory on the internet, but you are perceived as not queer because you haven't come out, then you're also going to be rejected by queer people. The comparative is that everyone is seen as a bit queer. Everyone is sort of on the spectrum, and everyone can participate in this discourse. And we want media to perpetuate this because media affects how you perceive your own queerness. This is the most important for people who are in the closet, because if they see these people that are so inspiring, but they can't come out, and this is the majority of the people in the world, because the majority of people that live in developing countries, they'll feel excluded and left out, and this is an immense emotional pain for them. For all these reasons, I'm so proud to stand in CG.
We thank the member of government for that fine speech. Sorry, I think it's half time. I need to check the score. But while I do that, can we please invite the member of the opposition to continue the case? Thank you.
Perfecto, right. Also, no spoilers for the match, but yeah. That's all I'll say.
Oh, I already told him to.
Oh, well, there we go. Well, I didn't do the spoilers, so I know it's outranked. Give me how he speaks. Panel, I would love a world where the main impact we should be considering is whether or not people discuss queer metaphysics a bunch. I would love that world because it would be really fun. But ultimately, it's not the world we're living in. The true things that matter is about humanizing the queer experience to other people and making sure that people who cannot come out get some vicarious acceptance through these tales. 2 points down. Firstly, on the way that this is a uniquely relatable element of the queer experience, because I want to know what this is, because acceptance of queerness generally, it's one characterization here, is limited by hetero and cis normativity. That is, it's not like seen as the dominant norm within society, and therefore when someone does it, it is somewhat surprising. But also, if you're not fully used to it whatsoever, and so you grew up in a household with a mother and a father, you presume that is the only two like kind of way people should ever, like, I don't know, kiss or something. But hopefully you don't see your parents kiss too much. But crucially then, if you then see people of the same gender broadly kissing, that is why you often have appraisals of disgust, right? That is not which is normal, that is not which I'm used to, and therefore I feel wrong because I believe that something is inherently correct about my experience historically. Meaning you get appraisals of disgust when you get these, when people see these kinds of things. But secondly, I want to note that everyone in the world has something which is central to their identity, which is somewhat secret at some stage of their life. Whether or not you have someone who's like an absolute jock in college, which you had to be a nerd at school, or the reverse, like me now that I do debating instead of rugby. But separately, these ideas of people who just feel shy at parties but try to act like they're really cool. People who don't really vibe with this fashion choices that they wear, but they just do so because it's that which is normal when they are growing up. I want to know if this happens to everyone, because norms are especially narrow, especially when you are growing up, i.e. the trope of trying to fit into some extent, and the way that it becomes very limited and very few people actually do naturally fit in. Therefore, for most people, there is something which they keep secret about themselves and which they feel limited by, or feel as that tension with the wider norms of society at different points across their life. These coming out stories are ultimately, if you go down to the bare bones, are stories about revealing the truth of your identity to those around you, being true to yourself and letting others know and hoping that they accept you for it. That is ultimately what this is about. So I want to know a few consequences of this. A, because that applies universally within the community, right? It doesn't matter what your perspective is on queer metaphysics. Ultimately, the idea of I want to be free and want others to know who I am is something which is true for all queer people. But B, I want to know that it is uniquely humanizing of queer people, because ultimately you relate to this experience even if you are not queer, at least somewhat. And so it is far more relatable to say, because OG point out that media often likes to posit positive things, therefore it will probably on the comparative depict like, I don't know, positive tales about like queer love or like being within the queer community. But people don't relate to that. Rather, that is that which they find discussed in almost as an inherent, like instinctual point, as reflex, and therefore the part that you need to bring them on board is show them that no, we are like you. We do just want to be ourselves, like how you used to want to be yourself, and now you have actualized that. And any opposition to our movement is the denial of that which you also agree is important. But I want to note C, because this is a very relatable story. It applies to a wider market when you are producing media, and therefore this gets produced more. We simply get more queer representation within media, which itself also normalizes, but also means we can probably depict a few different metaphysical views. On vicarious acceptance then, as a second point, because I want to know ultimately that queer people do have a visceral urge to come out. I think this is quite trivial, because first of all, even if like this wouldn't no longer be the main form of dominant media within queer media, these kinds of things, it has historically been to some extent, sure, you know, there have been different depictions such as euphoria, but also just so the narrative exists somewhat on either side. But secondly, it's just hiding who you are. living in the closet is not fun. It's quite funny for me as gender fluid because like one half of my closet is like girls' clothes, and that's the half that like when I open it up, it slides halfway, so I can have it like halfway open if someone else is in the room who I'm not out to, and they've got no idea. It's quite a good ruse. But ultimately, then it means that you're quite limited because it's constantly hiding who you are. It's an idea that I must be ashamed of somewhat, and I cannot vindicate my own identity to myself, but also I cannot be free in who I am. I want to note that ultimately a lot of people can't. In fact, I would say most queer people can never come out, either because their parents are older, as Owen noted, so they may have negative reactions, but also just they may have just realized too late in life, because maybe they grew up within that generation too, and there was even less queer representation. So maybe it wasn't even until that they're married, then they don't want to just with their family, so they never come out, they keep it a secret and suppress their identity for their entire life. But thirdly, just most people do live within society which aren't quite accepting of queer people. We seem to think that like, oh, the queer movement has done its job in most countries. No, it absolutely hasn't. Queer marriage isn't a thing in most places. Trans rights are an absolute joke even in so-called Western liberal democracies. Crucially then, what is the benefit of this? Because we say this media is a crucial outlet for those people who come out. Because while yes, you can't access acceptance yourself. You can't get the vindication of your identity. Your identity is vindicated within this media. That is to say, you see other people having that experience vindicated. It ultimately is, yes, my identity is not something which is inherently wrong. I should not feel ashamed of this because these people and their relatives and friends and family are not ashamed of this. It is not inherently wrong. It can be good. I will take opening government.
Look, we give you analysis on why the most well-known LGBTQ media tend to be made by privileged individuals from big Hollywood companies and will not be nuanced. This overly optimistic depiction gives the general public a false idea of the struggles LGBTQ individuals face, but also pushes people to come up before they're ready to do so.
This simply doesn't matter because people do recognize that this is different to their experience. I.e., if you are a queer person in a repressive state and you see like a coming out story about like a young guy in Ireland coming out, Red Devil, good movie, you will know, well, that's not where I live, so I can't do that. It's quite a simple like way of ultimately to some extent. Crucially then, secondly, I would note that this media places the audiences within the subject of the queer person whom is coming out. You see their friends' reactions and detail. There is notes, especially when it's books, like Stopper originally was, you have things like, ultimately, you note their thoughts of how they feel as they're coming out, the way that they feel pleasure within that, the way that they themselves feel accepted. But moreover, I want to the importance of this, recognizing then why other stories are insufficient. Because so the reason why they're placed the subject is because this is often queer creators making this, because like they're the ones who are good at picking the stories, and secondly, it's just more effective as like a narrative tool. Anyway, what is the importance of all of this, recognizing why other stories are insufficient? Because one, something can be beautiful and wrong in and of itself. That is to say, if you want to just depict queer love and say this is beautiful, that doesn't convince queer people of the part of themselves, the internalized homophobia that says, yeah, but it's still wrong. But secondly, I want to know family and friends have epistemic authority. You look up to your parents and the people around them, they're the people who should know best, not necessarily other queer people who I do not know, and therefore their opinion matters more. But thirdly, it's recognition of the other, because it's not someone similar to you saying you are beautiful, it is someone who is fundamentally different also accepting you, and thus that is vindication that you should not be ashamed. It's a teacher telling you a test didn't matter, rather than someone else who failed. It's like, yeah, of course you would say it. Ultimately, we get proper vicarious acceptance, we get recognition for people, and we get more humanizing of queer people across the world. I could not be prouder to stand in closing opposition.
We thank the member of the opposition for that fine speech, and we now have government wait for the last speech. The government that is here.
Great. I assume you can hear me fine. Yeah, I'll start in a couple of seconds. I'll take BOI around 5:30 in the shop. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. The big issue with our bench, and unfortunately with Jack specifically, is that they acknowledge that it is very difficult for people to come out, that most people never will. And then that we should give them this idea of bravery and hope for them to be free. I think it's quite offensive to assume that most people want to be out, want to be potentially harmed, want to be exposed in dangerous situations, and want to feel like they're excluded if their specific identity or if they're not the correct identity come out, as Robbie proves to you. First, be dealing with CO, then the top half. I think the issue with CO, and just to flag, is that I do think, although that was a beautiful speech, it's mostly derivative and contingent on OO, proving that people do feel brave or this media is done well. The assumption of Jack is as follows. Queer people should be free because closeted life is shit. Unfortunately, a couple of observations. One, closeted life is reality for most people. It is reality for most people in conservative countries, in developing countries, because that is where your identity doesn't matter, because the only most important thing to your family is you can have a career, you can take care of yourself. It is the idea in the entirety of the global south, and most people, as they notice, do not live in the conditions which they will ever be able to do it. And the point that this is a reality for most people, what is important for them is the comparative. Please note, panel, in your notes, the only team that actually analyzes what the comparative is closing government, because it's very difficult to adjudicate on is this one concept good or not, and the benefits of harms of it, if you cannot compare it to the other. To the extent to which media is a zero-sum game, what Rob is able to prove to you that if you do not focus on one thing, focus on the other. Intuitively, if you do not focus on coming out, you focus on everything in the rest of the queer life that doesn't involve coming out, meaning living as a closeted person, living in your fluidity and showing only the queer act. Know that this is very important, because then when we focus on that type of media, we allow people to feel free and feel comfortable to have their lover, which is the point of this is your sexuality, right? So the most important thing is for you to be able to access that type of thing comfortably, or your identity, even when you're by yourself. Then what do we say on the comparative is, firstly, Robbie is logically prior to closing opposition because he proves the normalization of more fluid entities where we do not need to name it. But secondly, and more importantly, is that people can feel free in not needing to come out. If our media on the comparative does not show coming out, it shows the intricacies of closeted life. It shows that you have to hide yourself with your partner from your parents. It shows that you're trying to somehow get into a gay club if you have it in Nigeria. It shows all of these things that do not involve coming out, that say you can still live an okay life and be comfortable and find a partner in this way, which note, that is how most people will live their queer identities in their life, as closing opposition agrees, meaning that just telling them that they should be brave and should be free when they could see most people are not going to do it anyway. The only way to make them feel more free and comfortable is the media that focuses more on not only the fluidity and showing all the different things that you can be, doesn't tell you what type of identity you should be to come out, but also focuses on the idea of a closeted life that, although yes might be difficult, is the only one that they can get. So might as well give them something, give them protagonists that deal with this type of shit, deal with having to date the other gender to pretend that they are straight, just so they can feel that this is the right way of living, because they're going to choose it anyway. They're not going to want to come out as oppositions concede. That is on closing opposition. I think the issue that I have on the top half is this. Yes, there is a debate about to what extent is this coming out being done good or bad. My issue with open government is this. If you look at their case in a vacuum, it doesn't really prove a delta, because they only can say a delta in conservative surroundings, but then they say the media is so idealized and unrelatable that most people are unlikely to come out. Meaning even if OG is able to prove a bit of a negative impact on some people, I'm quite unsure, as opening opposition notices, most people will still hear their father's comments, see stones being thrown at pride parades. Most people will probably notice that, as opposed to the idealized, unrelated media, meaning that I'm quite unsure what the impact or negative impact is on most people, or on people coming out in conservative areas, which they concede is quite unlikely. My issue with opening opposition is the next. I think that when they say, people see pain, euphoria winning awards, that means more discussion, your parents might not hate you, so this is good. I'm quite unsure why this is mutually exclusive. This can be done on the comparative if the media is, or all the incentives are as they stand, or show a closeted life in the same way, show that these people are suffering, that it's very difficult to pretend that you're straight all the time, that it's very difficult for you to date and pretend you're just your roommate and not a partner, or generally the coded life, the one that is also non-essential, it's not portrayed in only these specific things that media does. I think that we can also claim this on our side just without the coming out. I think that their issue is that they assert that coming out is good, but the analysis that you get on this is, I mean, what do you get? They give you tips and tricks to feel better, and then you can relate, you come out sooner. I'm quite unsure, is that a good thing though? Like, is it a good thing for people to feel like they're also supposed to do that, when in most cases, as they concede in rebuttal to opening government and leader of op, are unlikely to do? Meaning that I'm quite unsure why then also the negative and everything that they want for people to relate is something that is going to make people actually feel good about coming out. I don't think most people will, and I don't think most people relate in the very strict essentialist idea that they're proposing in this way, even if it's done nicely, dramatically, and it wins awards. It genuinely doesn't fucking matter for how people live their lives in Laos. I'll take Maria.
Having this focus allows you to show different perspectives in the future if there is a market and audience for this that would engage, right? This is something that we have on our side, at least in the future. What you don't have is a guarantee that you have any sort of discussion on your side of the house. We do.
No, but we still have queer media, and we still have discussions that just shows different things, or doesn't say the end point of your life is to come out. That is the important thing. It doesn't tell you the right way to live. And what Robbie proves to you in his first extension on what different identities exist, and also in the gatekeeping, is that it doesn't have to. I think the idea that you cannot live a good life without coming out is terrible. It offends most of the queer people. The only rebuttal that you have is contingent on you already previously winning the clash that people are going to do it. But to the extent to which they're unlikely to do it, the only way that they can feel comfortable is the comparative, is the way in which you can still have discussions, you can people relating to these types of protagonists for all the incentives you give us. We just say that I think for the most people that are going to want to have a partner in their life, who are probably going to hide it, but have to feel comfortable, they should not want to feel like the only way for them to be a valid queer person by Jack Palmer is to be out, is to expose yourself, to need to have discussions with your parents, to expect from them to love you back. Not necessarily. People can live a good life, but only if the media chooses to focus on that. If the media doesn't say the end point of your identity is to be an open gay male for the entirety of your life and to adhere to those types of choices. For these reasons, please vote closing government.
We thank government whip for that fine speech, and now for the last speech debate, can we call on opposition whip, please? Here.
Can I be heard? Okay. I know it was unintentional, but closing government have completely misunderstood Jack's case. Our point is not that you cannot be a queer person unless you are out. Our point is that the better world is the one in which people feel like every aspect of their identity is validated by the society in which they live. We are not in that world, but we approximate it better in closing opposition. That was our case. What were the responses we heard? The first is that it's offensive to say that people must be out or that they want to be out. This is not our case, so this doesn't matter. Secondly, is that we're derivative and contingent on opening opposition proving braveness. Our case was never about braveness. We don't care who comes out or who doesn't come out in our side of the house. It's about equipping people with the tools to understand and live with their own selves. So we're not reliant on that in any way, as will be explained later. First thing I want to do is do some framing. Firstly, notably, the motion says queer media. So any of the stuff in top half about like Hollywood incentives and stuff like that, I think is less important. I think this is made by queer people. But basically, I want to clear up what we're talking about before I get into the comparatives too deeply. So OG said that there's an incentive for positivity and brightness, these kinds of things. Opening opposition said there's an incentive for realism in these kinds of pieces of media. I mean, obviously, the synthesis of this is a scenario which is broadly positive, but contains some struggles, but has a happy ending in a context that's different than the one in which you currently inhabit, right? So most famous examples of queer media, like Call Me By Your Name, is like rich people in northern Italy in a super liberal context where their dad is also liberal, quite unrealistic off its face. Secondly, Sex Education is super liberal school, wealthy and educated parents, etc., who are all understanding. And people are aware that this is not the context in which they live. But nonetheless, it's still meaningful and realistic within the diegesis and within the context of the story being portrayed. The comparative then, I mean, like OG, when I asked on POI, said that you focus on struggles, but that can't be the case because of their own analysis on what you want to portray and the brightness you want to portray. So there's probably things like queer relationships, positivity, and queer romance. So let's talk about relatability. Opening oppositions say that people are sympathetic because they see the positive and negative effects of sympathy in the context of the coming out story that's portrayed. We explain that these experiences are relatable uniquely in comparison to, say, queer romance, which provokes a gut reaction to people because no one is 100% their true self all the time. Everyone has the experience of hiding some part of themselves, regardless of what their sexual or gender identity might be. How do we weigh this? Firstly, even if both claims are equally powerful at persuading people, we affect more people because this is more relatable and it's circulated more often, so it is more effective in terms of changing people's minds. Secondly, our claim is more powerful because it's about how we see the other people as human and begin to offer them that kind of sympathy. Thirdly, I think we're more connected to the motion because it's unclear in opening opposition why you couldn't elect this sympathy and just seeing how parents treat openly gay children as might be the comparative, versus on our side, it's about specifically the coming out and the relatability of hiding an element of yourself. I think fourthly as well, I think this garners sympathy even within the movement. Because I think the thing that, say, a trans woman and a gay man have in common is that they both have the experience of hiding some element of themselves. So it's relatable even within the movement, people who are likely to be the most supportive of you. Second thing I want to talk about is the experience of coming out that you can get vicariously on our side of the house. We told you three things. Firstly, recognition is fundamental to human dignity and flourishing. Secondly, these stories allow you access to an experience that you can, in some sense, even though you don't think it's real, still feel it as though it's real in some sense. And thirdly, that most people are unfortunately not and may never be able to come out. And these are the most vulnerable and most important individuals. They're the people that are deprived of their agency in the most meaningful way. Therefore, if coming out in a good context is good, we approximate it for those who can't access it. Now, opening opposition have similar claims to this. They say that when you see someone else who is also queer, it's a validation of identity and that's valuable. Two things on this. Firstly, I think this is less comparative than our claim because this seems like this would happen with any other kind of queer media insofar as, like, if you saw someone who was, say, for example, kissing a boy and you like kissing boys, that you might get that kind of a sense of relatability and experience then. So the more important claim is which of those things is more valuable to people in terms of getting the experience of it. I think Jack gives some like exceptional, emotional, empirical, philosophical, and sociological analysis that I can't recount now because I wouldn't do it justice. I think really lends the weight to this claim that was necessary for opening opposition. And notably, I don't think we're reliant on opening opposition saying that you put themselves in the shoes of the character. I think we give even more reasons for that anyways. Secondly, and this is weighing against, I think, CG's competing claim on this, is our analysis shows why coming out is more fundamental to the feeling of being queer. Not even if you don't want to come out, the feeling that you would want to live in a society where these things were validated is more fundamental to the queer experience. Whereas queer acts, I think, have more variance in them because what you want to do as a queer act depends on, firstly, your particular identity. You know, a gay woman and a trans man probably want to do different kinds of acts. So there's less variety in terms of the fact that in terms of the fact that the media becomes monopolized by some perspectives. You want that perspective to be one that has a universal element to it, which we think that coming out is. And secondly, it depends on your just personality outside of your queerness. Like, I mean, I might just not be attracted to the person that someone on the screen is kissing, and therefore I don't feel like my experience is being validated or get the vicarious experience of that. But I do get the vicarious experience when I can see someone coming out to their parents, even though I know that I never could. So it's more fundamental to the experience in this kind of way. So with that in mind, how do we beat the rest of the debate? I think I've already done the weighing against opening opposition, so I'm going to do it against government bench now, integrating some responses. With regards to opening government, I think the problem is with them is that the delta of change is very low because they're reliant on people coming out and against their better instincts and experience. I think the thing is, like, firstly, the feeling of presence within the media is isolated to the context of consuming the media. So you don't explain to us why you change your expectations and understanding of your family dynamics outside of this. But secondly, I also just think in general, most people test the waters when they're doing these things. They maybe talk to their parents about queer issues to see what they think about them, and they maybe don't come out fully unless they get a kind of positive interaction with that in those contexts. Before I explain why this beats OG.
Look, we gave an analysis as to why for conservative individuals, oftentimes the media is the main way they actually understand how coming out and the outcomes actually apply, right? We think that we would rather individuals stay safe and don't actually have
but the problem is that this is reliant on those people who know how their parents vote and have seen them talking about, I don't know, drag clubs and like queer nightclubs or gay people in general, and those people deciding that the media is a more faithful and true representation of what their experience of coming out would be than their actual experience of their own life or their own family in real life. I think the viscera of that experience, I think, is more fundamental, so that just doesn't work. We provide a better coming out experience anyway, as far as we change people's minds. We have a better experience for those who don't come out. Right, so we're beating opening government there. With regards to closing government, I think the extension is really interesting. Problem, though, is I don't think that they are able to get the kinds of intricacies of queer experience and life that they want on their side of the house because of the fact that it becomes monopolized by a particular perspective, probably the essentialist one for context anyways. But I still think we beat them on this claim anyway, because firstly, if we get more queer media circulating, we're able to keep this more relatable. It will get more variety of experiences in it. But secondly, because of my previous weighing against this in my point about relatability, because this is on aggregate likely to be more universal to the experience, it doesn't reject as many people's experiences in that context. So I think we're beating closing government on that claim as well, because I think that to be human is to be seen. And I think that when we can be seen as who we are, even if that's only on a television screen for 2 hours a night, that's fundamental. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thanks everyone for a fantastic debate. I invite all the quarterfinalists to virtually cross the floor, shake hands, and please leave the room. The the results will be announced shortly.